In this video, we'll go over recalling text files. When selecting a text file for recall in SoundCheck, it's also required to use a .imp file. This is a pre-configured import file that will tell SoundCheck how to interpret the text file. We can create an IMP file by running the import wizard. This is required to tell SoundCheck how to interpret the data. Unlike a .dat file, which contains all the metadata directly from SoundCheck, a text file can be configured in many different ways. Maybe you have to specify that it's tab delimited data in columns with phase, or maybe it's comma delimited or space delimited, or maybe it's organized into rows. We'll need to specify how to interpret this so SoundCheck can recall the appropriate data. Once we go through all the steps of the import wizard though, we can save it to a .imp file. We can use that IMP file to recall curves that are in the same format. As well as watching this video, Appendix O in the SoundCheck manual will give an overview of how to recall text files and use the import wizard. Now let's jump over to SoundCheck. I'm going to start with a sequence that I just ran that calculated the fundamental curve. It's this curve displayed on this XY graph in blue. I'll use an autosave step to save this out as a text file. I'm saving the X and Y axes, laying it out in rows with a standard header out to 4 decimal places. That text file will be saved in my SoundCheck 17 data folder with the user-defined name Fundamental Curve. I'll click Apply to create the text file. Here in the data folder is the text file I just created. I'll open up a new sequence and add in a recall step to bring this back into SoundCheck. When I open it, you can see there's a place for an IMP file as well as the file path. Text is the only thing that requires this IMP file. If I'm using specify, automatic, or prompt operator, I still need to tell SoundCheck how to interpret the data. But to first create this IMP file, I'll need to use specify file path and then point to the text file I'm interested in to initially read it. And here is the import wizard. On this first page, I'll tell it how my data is delimited and how my data is configured, either in columns or rows. Right now it's set to delimited with tabs, and you can see in this chart above, it's correctly taking out the X and the Y data and applying it to different rows and columns. If I chose something different, it would look for a comma before choosing the next piece of data. If you're not using a common delimiter, you could specify a fixed width or choose other from the delimiter dropdown and enter in your custom delimiter. Next, I'll specify if my data is in columns or rows and how to offset it. Right now we see column 1 starts where my serial number field is, and data begins starts where my header is. I want to offset these by 1 so SoundCheck is recalling data where there's actual data. I could also specify if a header is included and which row it's on. Right now my data is set to columns instead of rows. If we click Next, it'll be fairly obvious I have a wrong setting. I jump to the next page and you can see it looks like I have 2 X points with a whole bunch of Y data. I actually only have X and Y1, so it's very obvious I got it wrong. I can simply just go to the previous page and fix my mistake. If you're going through this editor and you see something is set incorrectly, feel free to go back, make the correction, and continue on again. Now here's what I expect. I have 1 row of X data and 1 row of Y data to make one single curve. At the bottom I can specify where my X and Y axes are. This text file is pretty straightforward, so it's set correctly as it is. X-axis set to common can be used if you have multiple curves, but all using the same X-axis. If I had frequency response, THD, rub and buzz, those would be 3 different Y values, all referencing the same X value. So I could set my X-axis to common, and then specify 3 different Y-axes. If I had 3 different curves with 3 different X-axes, I could set these to increment or set them individually. We'll look at that in the next example, but since we only have 1 piece of data, it doesn't really matter what we choose here. I can choose which row to start my X and Y axes on, and as I increase them you can see there's no actual data, so the X and Y disappear from the chart. My x-axis should be row 1, y-axis should be row 2, so this setup is fine. So I'll click Next. On the next page is where we're going to set the units and number of curves. It inherited the settings from the last page, and I have one curve over here called curve 1. If I had multiple curves I wanted to recall, I would click this Add button here. I don't, so I'll remove it. In the next section, it inherited from the previous page that the x-axis is in row 1 and the y-axis is in row 2. Now I can specify the data type and what units they are. The x-axis is set to linear data type with a unit of hertz, and the y is set to a dB type referencing 20 micropascals, which is dB SPL, so all of these are correct. I don't have any phase data, so I'll leave this box unchecked, and I'll specify the name I want. I'll call this fundamental. If I click Finish, it will recall this curve in. Or I can click Save Settings, which will save this .imp file to be used later. I want to use this in my recall step, so I'll select Save Settings, give it a name, and click OK. Now in my recall step, it's automatically pointing to that .imp file, and when I run the sequence, it will import the text file using these settings and give me a curve. Now here's my fundamental with an x-axis in hertz, a y-axis in dB SPL, that looks exactly like we autosaved from my previous step. I'll do one more example of how to import a text file. In my previous sequence that I used to create the fundamental, I'll also save out harmonics 2 and 3, and this time I will include the phase data, which is the z-axis. Instead of using tab, I'll switch to comma delimiter, select my layout to be in columns, add in the z-axis, and change the name. Here's what that text file looks like. Now let's go back to our original recall sequence. I'll change the name of the first recall step to recall fundamental to keep the two apart, and then I'll drag in another recall text template. I'll use specify file path and point to that text file we just saved. On the first page, I switch from tab to comma delimited, and I'll offset the data to make sure it starts in the correct place. On the next page, since we have multiple pieces of data we're trying to bring in, we'll need to be a little bit more careful with our settings here. Since we're bringing in harmonics, they actually don't share the same x-axis. Harmonic 2 goes up to 10K, but harmonic 3 only goes up to 6.7K, which we can see in column 1 and column 5. With our x-axis set to common, our data would not be brought in correctly. If we left it as default, it would attempt to bring in 6 different curves with one x-axis. Incrementing our data is telling SoundCheck that we're going to have y data every 2 columns on our common x-axis. We could also set our x-axis to increment as well. But since our data is set up a little bit differently, I'm actually just going to set them individually. And we'll click Next. On curve 1, our x-axis is starting at column 1, and our y-axis data is starting at column 2. And our units are set up correctly. Hertz on the x, dB SPL on the y. I want to add in my phase data from column 3. I'll enable this checkbox. You can see column 3 gets filled out with z-axis data, and we get new controls available for our phase. This is what I want, so I'm all set here. Now I want to bring in my second curve. I click Add here. This will copy all the information that I already filled out and add it to my curve 2. I'll just simply change the name from harmonic 2 to harmonic 3 and specify new starting columns for the data. Instead of 1 and 2, we want to start on 5 and 6. Here you can see x2, y2, which is harmonic 3, and the phase data. Everything here is set correctly, so once again I'll save these settings as a .imp file. We needed to use specify file path to point to the text file to initially read it to create the .imp. Once the .imp is there, we don't need to use specify file path. Now I point to my harmonics curves, and here they are. I'll change the colors a little bit so it's easier to see. Harmonic 2 is in red, harmonic 3 is in blue. Now if I right-click and enable the phase, we can see that this data was also brought in correctly. In the next video, we'll go over some of the different options for importing WAV files.